Today we're going to judge the soldering skills of Reddit. We're going to find some posts that look like people are struggling with learning how to solder, and we're going to give some advice on how really to do it and to do it well. This person has a laptop keyboard, flat cable traces broken. So it looks like the conductive layer has been scratched off here, probably from multiple replugging or not taking enough care when servicing the laptop. So basically my old Dell XPS M1330 keyboard stopped working. Some rows of keys stopped working. I figured it was the oxidized contacts on the flat cable, so being the dumb person I am, I wouldn't encourage you to call yourself dumb. I scratched them with a cutter blade a bit too hard and ended up cutting the traces. Any suggestions are appreciated. Okay. What I would have recommended to start with would just be an alcohol swab. And I don't know what the other end of this looks like, if the contacts are visible and able to be cleaned. If not, I would insert this in and out a couple times, 2 or 3. This stuff can be kind of sensitive. It's not made to be unplugged and plugged back in very many times. It's just made really to be plugged in one time. But you can get away with multiple, of course. Clean it with the alcohol, insert it in and out a few times, and then clean it with the alcohol a second time. And if the alcohol doesn't seem to be working, then you want to use some kind of light abrasive, because if it's already broken, if you break it more trying to fix it, it's not really a loss. So maybe a pencil eraser could remove oxidation. This isn't something I have particularly dealt with, so I'm kind of just throwing some ideas out there. But I have cleaned contacts inside of things before that really weren't even made to be taken apart, and alcohol has done a good job at removing the oxidation, so that's where I'd start. But to fix this mistake, it does look salvageable, but you're not going to fix it by soldering. So again, I would start with the alcohol, see if that removes any oxidation. These spots on the edges here, or not edges, these light spots, that could be oxidation. If that goes away after you clean it up and all the alcohol is dried up, then you know it's worked. And then if you want to restore these connections, you'll want to use a conductive paint, a really thin stuff, and you have to be very careful with applying it. And that's the first thing that I would suggest. If that doesn't work, you'll have to replace the cable. And without seeing the other end, I don't know how you would go about removing it and putting a new one on and procuring this cable as an off-the-shelf part. It might be more economical just to replace the keyboard, or the laptop might not even be worth replacing the keyboard. You might just want to set it up as in a permanent location using a USB keyboard. So this looks like a joke post, tinned and ready, but the iron isn't taking a tin very well. It's not horrible. This would solder, but what I would recommend to keep your tip nice and healthy is, well, I'll just tell you what I do that works really well. I use brass wool, and I am incessantly cleaning my tip in the brass wool. Every time I solder a joint, I'll put it in the brass wool. Every time I'm going to put my iron back, I clean it in the brass wool. Before I turn my iron off, I'll clean it in the brass wool. And then when I turn my iron off, I'll clean it in the brass wool one more time to make sure it was clean right before it got turned off. And really, that's what I do, is I clean it in the brass wool after pretty much everything. And before a lot of things as well. I don't usually have to explicitly tin it. Tip tinner can help clean up a tip that's gotten really dirty and doesn't want to take tinning from the wire. And I've heard a lot of people say that they use a wet sponge or a wet sponge and brass wool. In my personal experience, the wet sponge isn't necessary. Now, maybe I haven't done the work that the wet sponge helps with, or maybe since I haven't used it, I just don't know how good it is. But I don't use it. I've never had a perceived need to use it. So I can't really speak to its effectiveness. But I know the brass wool is a huge help in keeping my iron clean. That's a must-have. Something to keep the tip clean is a must-have. And the brass wool is what I recommend. All right, here's somebody looking for feedback. I'm not sure what this is for a motor. Okay. It's difficult to tell if the wire was spliced before soldering. It looks shiny on this side, which is a good sign. There's a little more than necessary on all of them. But again, it's better to have a little more than you need than not enough. In this picture, it's not the best picture. It looks like it could be a little cloudy. This definitely right here looks like it didn't get enough heat, didn't get enough solder in this spot. With copper wire, what you really want to do is make sure you get the whole thing wet with solder, because the copper is going to draw away the heat. It conducts the heat really well. So sometimes that means a lot of time with the iron. And you want to be careful with that, because if you have a lot of time with the iron, you could really melt this insulation, which could just be an issue with it contacting something it shouldn't. And then on that note, you really want to use heat shrink tubing, which you have to apply first. Or not apply first. You have to at least get it sleeved on. And the other ends of these wires are out of frame. So he could have heat shrink tubing ready to go, or he could be using electrical tape. But another thing that's a good idea is to stagger your joints. So instead of having them all next to each other, looking for one where the wires are long, take this one and move it up this way, take this one and move it down this way. That way, even if the insulation were to fail for whatever reason covering the joints, you still don't have an issue with them touching each other, as long as the wires aren't looping back on each other or looping back on themselves. But the way I would do this is strip back about 1/2 inch of the wire on both, and then instead of tinning them first, well, first thing, you want to size up your heat shrink tubing with plenty of excess. It's better to have a little more than you need than not enough. That even applies to heat shrink tubing. And go ahead and get it slid on there, and then you want to splice, well, any splice that's a good splice, dry, is what you want to use. I like to use the one, I don't know what it's called, but you cross the wires like an X and then you twist them around each other. And that splice, it does pull apart fairly easily. But once you add solder, then it makes a nice solid joint, and it's a nice inline joint. So overall, these don't look bad, but this needs reflowed, and it needs to be made sure it gets nice and hot. And if this one is like that, I would do it with all three of them. And here's what the first comment says, or the top comment: stagger the joints and shrink wrap. That is definitely what you want to do with that. Okay, here's someone asking, is it okay for solder to span multiple pins like this? If the answer isn't obvious, I'm not really sure what to say. The answer is no. So he says, hi, it's my first time soldering and it's hard to be precise when the pins are small. My question is, will this work? If not, any advice to solder thin pins like this? Thank you for reading my post. Well, I've got news for this guy. The pins aren't that small. As technology and electronic technology advances, things get smaller and smaller, and these are pretty far apart by today's standards. If this is difficult, I don't recommend starting here. I recommend starting with through-hole parts that are not really close together. That way you can get a feel for the technique of how to solder and how to apply enough solder, because there's way too much here. This one right here on the edge looks like it has the right amount of solder, but it also looks cold. So what I would recommend in order to solder this part is to get it aligned, or really, before you get it aligned, get some solder, pre-tin one corner of the part. And then as you have that hot with the iron, with tweezers, set this part down and line it up with the iron, heating up the pad and the pin. And then once that's lined up, solder the other side, and then come back and retouch this side. Make sure it's a good joint. Add some extra solder if you have to, or extra flux. And then solder all the pins. And pins this size, I would use, in this open space, most tips are usable here. I wouldn't use like a flat face tip. I would just go with a regular cone tip. And if you place the iron right here, like right here, or right beside of it, that way you can get the pad and the pin relatively easily. Add solder not directly to the iron, but add it, well, sometimes the heat doesn't like to transfer until there's solder. You might have to add a little directly to the iron, but you want to add it while the iron is on the parts to be soldered. And then you only want to add a little bit. A part this small only really needs one touch of solder. And to the naked eye, it can look like not enough. It's okay to add a little extra, but it's really not necessary. So I would do that with every joint. You can drag solder this as well, but with parts with pins that are this far apart, you really don't have to. I would just do it one by one. That's the way I would do it. But to clean this up, I would choose a chisel tip and try and get these three at the same time and just kind of drag the solder downwards, or even try to take advantage of what's there and drag solder it over, and then get all these with some solder put some extra flux on it, and then go to every joint one by one. But the most straightforward route with the least cleanup is going to be to take the chisel tip, move this solder off, move it downwards, and if you can't get the job done with that, use a little bit of desoldering wick with flux in it, and remove some excess that way. And then you can reintroduce just a little dab of solder on each one of these pins individually. And you want to make sure you've got enough heat on the pins that you don't get this kind of situation right here, because this is a cold joint. This got hot and this got hot, but not at the same time. You can see how this is kind of its own bulb and this is kind of its own spot, but they weren't flowed together, so that would need to be reflowed. Though in terms of solder quantity, it's more than necessary, but it's not too much like this is. And I'm sorry for the plosives in the mic. This mic always does this, even when I'm not very close to it. I'm not sure why. I've got a pop filter on it. But in short, the answer to the question, the top comment says it. Nope, it's called bridging and it's bad. You definitely don't want that. So that's all the advice I have in this video. If it's helped you at all, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. That way I know doing more of these videos is going to be worthwhile for you guys and be a real help to the community. See you guys in the next one.